Why does India, a major CO2 producer, and relatively wealthy country, receive the highest amount of world aid? Where is climate justice for the vulnerable and marginalized people of developing nations? I am Dr. Asher, the climate connoisseur, and I will unveil the hidden truth. Let's explore. Which nations are most responsible for climate change and who bears the burden of its effects? The world is at a critical climate crisis, struggling with the immense challenge of climate change, which poses dire consequences for both the environment and human societies. To truly understand the magnitude of this crisis, it is vital to explore the nations that contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions and acknowledge the disproportionate impact climate change has on different countries. In recent years, a stark contrast has emerged, with India witnessing significant emissions growth while countries like Pakistan suffer severe consequences despite their limited contributions to global emissions. Here are the nations responsible for climate change, unveiling the giants. China, the dragon's footprint. China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, shoulders a significant portion of global emissions. Despite recent efforts to address this issue, China's heavy reliance on coal and rapid industrialization continue to contribute to its towering emissions. Recent data reveals that China accounts for approximately 28% of global carbon dioxide, CO2, emissions, 10% of methane, CH4, emissions, and 7% of nitrous oxide, N2O, emissions. United States, a Goliath among nations. The United States, historically one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, owes its position to a combination of a robust economy and high energy consumption. While strides have been made in reducing emissions, the nation still ranks prominently in terms of total emissions. The U.S. contributes approximately 15% of global CO2 emissions, 16% of CH4 emissions, and 5% of N2O emissions. India, the energetic transformer. India's recent surge in emissions is closely tied to its expanding economy and rising energy demands. With a heavy reliance on coal for electricity generation, India has become the world's third largest emitter of both CO2 and CH4. Its contribution to global emissions stands at approximately 7% for both CO2 and CH4, while its impact on N2O emissions remains relatively lower. Russia, taming the bear's carbon footprint. Russia, known for its vast reserves of fossil fuels, emerges as the fourth largest emitter of CO2 globally, accounting for approximately 5% of global emissions. Additionally, it contributes around 12% of global CH4 emissions and 7% of N2O emissions. The country's reliance on fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, is a significant driver of its emissions. Japan, the rising sun and its environmental shadows. Japan, a major industrialized nation with substantial energy consumption, finds itself grappling with emission challenges. While Japan has made efforts to transition to cleaner energy sources, it still heavily relies on fossil fuels. It contributes approximately 3% of global CO2 emissions, 4% of CH4 emissions, and 2% of N2O emissions. Germany, the heart of Europe's carbon struggle. Germany, one of Europe's largest emitters, shoulders its share of the greenhouse gas burden. With approximately 2% of global CO2 emissions, 1% of CH4 emissions, and 1% of N2O emissions, Germany's economy heavily relies on manufacturing and coal-fired power plants, both contributing factors to its emissions. Iran, the Middle East's silent emitter. Iran, a major contributor to greenhouse gases in the Middle East, faces its own emission challenges. Contributing approximately 2% of global CO2 emissions, 1% of CH4 emissions, and 1% of N2O emissions, the country heavily relies on fossil fuels, particularly oil and natural gas, for energy production. Saudi Arabia, an emission oasis. Saudi Arabia, fueled by its massive oil and gas industry, emerges as a significant emitter of greenhouse gases. Accounting for approximately 2% of global CO2 emissions, 1% of CH4 emissions, and 1% of N2O emissions, the country's economy is highly dependent on fossil fuel exports. South Korea, the industrial powerhouse. South Korea, a major industrialized nation with soaring energy consumption, finds itself grappling with emissions. Contributing approximately 2% of global CO2 emissions, 1% of CH4 emissions, and 1% of N2O emissions, the country's manufacturing sector and dependence on coal and oil for energy fuel its emissions. Canada, a per capita carbon paradox. Canada, on a per capita basis, emerges as one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. It accounts for approximately 1.6% of global CO2 emissions, 1% of CH4 emissions, and 1% of N2O emissions. Canada's emissions are largely attributed to its energy-intensive industries and oil extraction from oil sands. Now let's talk about nations most affected despite limited contributions, unveiling the disproportionate burden. Pakistan, struggling against the climate's fury. Pakistan, a highly vulnerable country, experiences the devastating consequences of climate change. Despite its relatively low contribution to global emissions, approximately 0.8% for CO2 and 0.5% for CH4, it suffers from frequent and severe climate-related disasters. Floods, heat waves, and droughts ravage the nation, significantly impacting agriculture, infrastructure, and the well-being of its population. Bangladesh, the frontline battler. Bangladesh, nestled in a low-lying delta region, faces a constant battle against rising sea levels and increased cyclonic activity. Frequent flooding wreaks havoc on infrastructure, agriculture, and human lives. Although responsible for around 0.4% of global CO2 emissions, Bangladesh stands at the forefront of climate-related challenges. Philippines, nature's wrath in paradise. The Philippines, situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire, battles the relentless onslaught of typhoons, floods, landslides, and extreme weather events. Rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion deeply impact agriculture and coastal communities. Despite contributing approximately 0.3% of global CO2 emissions, the Philippines suffers as one of the countries most affected by climate change. Vietnam, a nation caught in the storm. Vietnam finds itself highly exposed to the impacts of climate change due to its long coastline, vulnerable agricultural regions, and dense population in low-lying areas. The country faces an increased risk of flooding, coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion, adversely affecting agriculture, infrastructure, and human settlements. Despite contributing about 0.5% of global CO2 emissions, Vietnam experiences severe climate-related challenges. Ethiopia, struggling against nature's wrath, Ethiopia battles climate change-induced droughts, desertification, and food insecurity. The country's heavy reliance on agriculture renders it particularly vulnerable to changes in precipitation patterns and extreme weather events. Despite its relatively low emissions, approximately 0.1% of global CO2 emissions, Ethiopia faces significant challenges in adapting to and mitigating the impacts of climate change. Haiti, a fragile nation in nature's path. Haiti, a Caribbean nation, endures the frequent onslaught of hurricanes, floods, and landslides, resulting in loss of life, displacement, and infrastructure destruction. Deforestation, poverty, and limited resources for adaptation and disaster preparedness exacerbate the country's vulnerability to climate change. Haiti's contributions to global CO2 emissions are relatively small, around 0.03%, yet it bears the brunt of climate-related disasters. Nepal, Himalayan vulnerability. Despite contributing only 0.025% of global CO2 emissions, Nepal faces significant climate change impacts. Melting glaciers, extreme weather events, and agricultural challenges pose threats to water sources, livelihoods, and food security. Limited resources and marginalized communities exacerbate vulnerability. International cooperation is crucial for addressing Nepal's climate burden. There are many small island developing states, SIDS, the front line of survival. Additionally, small island developing states, SIDS, such as the Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nepal, landlocked country located between India to the east, south, and west and the Tibet Autonomous Region of China to the north face particularly dire consequences due to climate change. With their low-lying territories, these nations are threatened by rising sea levels, freshwater scarcity, and increased vulnerability to extreme weather events. Despite contributing minimally to global emissions, the very existence of these island nations hangs in the balance. Dear friends, join me in spreading an honest demand for global unity and give. A call for global cooperation and climate justice. Addressing climate change necessitates collective action from all nations, particularly those with the highest emissions. China, the United States, Russia, and India, as the largest emitters, accept a critical responsibility in global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, it is essential to recognize that the consequences of climate change are far from equitable. Countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Nepal and Haiti suffer disproportionately from catastrophic disasters despite their limited contributions to global emissions. This reality call attention to the urgent need for global cooperation, assistance, and climate justice. To combat climate change effectively, the adoption of sustainable practices, transition to renewable energy sources, and support for vulnerable nations in adaptation and mitigation efforts are paramount. Only through international collaboration and a shared commitment to reducing emissions can we mitigate the severity of climate change and safeguard the future of our planet. The time for action is now. Here is something truly eye-opening that demands attention. Despite India's significant contribution to CO2 emissions, it has surprisingly received the highest amount of aid from the United States, as revealed by data compiled and published by the United States Agency for International Development (USAID) in 2015. The report states that from the period of 1946 to 2012, India received a total of $65.1 billion in economic aid, adjusted for inflation. You can find the factual information on the following website. Foreign aid to India, https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/foreign_aid_to_India #site_note 2. It is worth noting that as polite people in Pakistan bearing climate crises, we prioritize sharing factual information and references rather than spreading fake news or rumors. Additionally, it is important to mention that India is the country that received the most foreign aid, with over $4.2 billion in aid from members of the Development Assistance Committee, DAC, in 2017. Turkey was a close second with $4.1 billion in aid received. The question arises as to why a rich country like India receives such substantial aid when it is facing issues of poverty, unemployment, inflation, casteism, untouchability, and other factors. While India may possess wealth, its population struggles with these socio-economic challenges, which contribute to its high CO2 emissions. It is crucial for donors to exercise caution and consider these complex factors when providing aid. If you're interested in truth, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you.